"Will you walk me to school?" the little girl asked, a grumpy CEO millionaire who lived. It was a chilly autumn morning in the city. The streets were alive with chatter, laughter, and rushing footsteps. But inside the tallest glass tower downtown sat a man who felt none of it. Richard Hale, a 50-year-old CEO worth billions, stared out of his corner office window. He was the kind of man newspapers called the Iron Millionaire, a ruthless, grumpy workaholic with no family, no friends, and certainly no patience for life outside contracts and profits. To him, emotions were weaknesses, love was a distraction, and children just noisy interruptions to his carefully controlled world. But fate has a strange way of breaking walls we build around ourselves. That morning, as Richard stepped out of his luxury black car, adjusting his tie with his usual scowl, he noticed something unusual. Right outside his mansion gate stood a little girl, no older than 7, clutching a worn-out backpack, her small hands trembling in the cold. She looked up at him with the most innocent eyes and whispered, "Will you walk me to school?" Richard froze, irritated. He wasn't used to strangers, least of all children, talking to him. "What? No. Ask your parents," he muttered, brushing past her. But the girl didn't move. Her shoes were scuffed, her sweater too thin for the cold, and yet she stood there with quiet determination. "I don't have anyone else," she said softly, her voice breaking. Something inside Richard stirred, something he hadn't felt in decades. A grumpy CEO meets innocence. The following day, she was there again, and again the day after that, always waiting outside his gates, always asking the same question, "Will you walk me to school?" At first, Richard ignored her. He told his driver to speed past. He even instructed his security guard to chase her away. But every morning, like clockwork, she returned. Finally, one morning, his irritation boiled over. He stormed out of his car and barked, "Why me? Out of everyone in this city, why are you bothering me?" The girl looked up with big, tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Because you remind me of my daddy." Before he went away, Richard's heart skipped. For a moment, the busy city noise around him faded. He stared at her truly, stared and saw the loneliness carved into her tiny face. Against every instinct, he sighed heavily and muttered, "Fine, just this once." And so, for the first time in decades, Richard Hale, the grumpy CEO millionaire, walked a little girl to school. The unlikely bond. That single walk turned into another, then another. At first, Richard was stiff and silent, keeping his distance. But children have a way of breaking through barriers adults think are unshakable. On their walks, the little girl, whose name was Emily, chattered endlessly. She told him about her favorite teacher, the stories she read in class, the stars she wished on at night, and how she sometimes went to bed hungry but still dreamed of becoming a writer one day. Richard listened grudgingly at first, but slowly, something inside him began to melt. For the first time in years, someone was speaking to him without asking for money, power, or favors. She was speaking to him simply because she wanted to. One day, he finally asked, "Where's your mother?" Emily hesitated. Then she quietly revealed the truth. Her mother worked double shifts as a waitress, barely making ends meet. Her father had abandoned them years ago. Emily was often left to care for herself, walking to school alone, cooking small meals, and pretending everything was fine. Richard felt a pang deep in his chest. He saw in Emily the reflection of his own childhood, a boy raised in poverty, abandoned by his father, and hardened by a world that never showed kindness. He had vowed never to feel weak again, but here was this fragile little girl, showing strength he never had at her age. Transformation of a millionaire days turned into weeks. Richard found himself rearranging his busy schedule just to make time for those morning walks. His employees were shocked when he began showing up later to meetings, smiling faintly instead of barking orders. Emily brought laughter back into his cold mansion. She teased him when he frowned, called him Mr. Grumpy, and even convinced him to cook pancakes together one Sunday morning. Slowly, Richard transformed. The man who once cared only for profits began noticing people: the janitor he ignored, the secretary he never thanked, the employees who worked late into the night. He started treating them with kindness, something unheard of before. The crisis, but life has a way of testing the bonds it creates. One evening, Richard received a call. Emily had collapsed at school. Malnutrition and exhaustion had taken a toll on her tiny body. She was rushed to the hospital, her mother weeping by her side. For the first time in years, Richard's heart broke. He cancelled board meetings, ignored calls from investors, and rushed to the hospital, pacing outside the emergency room like a terrified parent. When the doctor finally emerged, Richard braced himself. She recovered, the doctor said, but she needs stability. Good food, rest, care. She can't keep living the way she has been. Richard walked into the room and saw Emily lying pale and weak, her small hand clutching her mother's. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Will you still walk me to school?" Tears filled Richard's eyes, tears he hadn't shed since childhood. He knelt beside her bed and said, "I'll do more than that, Emily. I'll walk with you through life, redemption, and legacy." From that day forward, Richard Hale changed completely. He began funding Emily's education, helping her mother with work, and creating foundations to support underprivileged children across the city. But more than his wealth, he gave Emily what she had been longing for: stability, guidance, and love. He attended her school plays, helped her with homework, and made sure she never felt alone again. The newspapers noticed his transformation. The man once known as the Iron Millionaire was now called the Guardian of Hope. But Richard didn't care about titles anymore. All he cared about was the little girl who had knocked on his heart and changed his life with one simple question. Final message years later. When Emily graduated as valedictorian, she stood on stage, looked out at the crowd, and spotted Richard sitting proudly in the front row. With tears in her eyes, she said, "When I was a little girl, I asked a man, 'Will you walk me to school?' I had no idea that question would change both of our lives. He wasn't just walking me to school, he was walking me into a future full of hope, love, and dreams." Sometimes, all it takes is one small act of kindness to heal a broken soul. And Richard Hale, the once grumpy CEO, smiled with tears in his eyes, finally at peace. Inspiration. This story reminds us that wealth and success mean nothing without love, compassion, and human connection. Sometimes, the smallest voice can teach the greatest lessons, and one act of kindness can change the course of two lives forever.